Sophia, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. And to all of our participants, thank you for joining us. So I will start our presentation with a very brief introduction to the historical background of the late 19th century and early 20th century Georgia, and how Oliver and Marjory Wardrop were and with their work were related to the historical processes that were taking place in Georgia and what were relations between Georgia and Britain. And then I'll give floor to Nikoloz and Nutsa, who will be speaking about the letters that we have collected from the wardrobe collections and that we have worked on and are currently working on translations. So give me a second. I will just share my screen now.
Oh, wait, apologies, Megi. I just realized I introduced the whole thing before pressing to the recording. So I just want to quickly say what I already said, that we're having three fantastic speakers, Nikoloz, Aleksidze, Nutsa, Batiashvili, both of Free Uni, and Megi Kartsivadze of Oxford University. This project was initiated by Free Uni and it's being funded by the Shota Rustaveli National Science Foundation. So thank you so much and apologies, guys.
Okay, no worries. Okay, I'll share the screen now. Here we go. Okay, so let's do 19th century Georgia. So this is a map of Georgia in the late 19th century, which was under the Russian Empire. And under the Russian colonial rule, Georgian autonomy was fully dismantled. Its cultural and political institutions were fully subjugated to intense Russification. And the Russian Empire pursued policies aimed at assimilating Georgian population, restricting its cultural and educational administration. So, but despite this colonial and imperial efforts, Georgia experienced a remarkable intellectual and cultural revival at the end of the 19th century, when the figures such as Ilya Chavchavadze, Agagit Tsereteli, and Vazhev Shavelov were considered to be the founding fathers of the Georgian nation, started writing literary works as well as publishing Georgian press. So basically, they laid the foundation to Georgian nationalism as we understood it as a product of the 18th or 19th century. So these thinkers were writers who sought to preserve Georgia's distinct identity through literature, historical scholarship, political activism. But outside the Russian Empire, Georgia remained largely unknown. And it was in this period when two British scholars, Marjory and Oliver Wardrop, emerged as an unexpected but pivotal figures in the international recognition of Georgia's culture and political aspirations as well. So these are Oliver and Marjory Wardrops, whom you can see on the screen. They were born into a family of Scottish origins in the late 19th century, and they were surrounded by the intellectual environment that encouraged their interest in travel, scholarship, and linguistic studies. Oliver Wardrop was an explorer, diplomat, writer who traveled around the world, and he first encountered Georgia in 1887 during an unextended journey through the Caucasus. And he was so fascinated by the region's history, language, culture, traditions that he immersed himself in Georgian society and traveled extensively across the country. Later, he published the book, The Kingdom of Georgia, which was one of the first English language accounts of Georgian history and culture. His sister, Marjory Wardrop, at that time remained in Britain. She was a gifted linguist who spoke spoke several languages, and he was inspired by his brother's trips to Georgia. And he became quite enthusiastic for the country. So she started learning Georgian language here in Britain. And Varlam Cherkezishvili, who was a Georgian emigre and they're a good friend of Wardrop family, helped her to learn Georgian language. So she became a quite fluent speaker in Georgian. And it's quite remarkable that at the time when Russian scholars and administrators in the Russian Empire, after almost 100 years of colonial rule and imperial rule over Georgia, they showed basically little interest in learning Georgian language, translating Georgian literature. But Marjory Wardrop became one of the first Westerners to systematically engage with Georgia's literary heritage, although she had never been in the country before at the time. And here you can see her most significant works that were published at the time. It was the first English translation of Shota Rustaveli's Night in the Panther Skin, also Sulkhan Saba Orbeliani's the Book of Wisdom and Lies, and but later in 1996, I believe, or 5, she traveled to Georgia with his brother. And here you can see a photo in which Marjory, with their parents, is standing next to Ilia Chavchavadze at Ilia Chavchavadze's place. So basically, she engaged in active translations and active social and cultural life in Georgia. And from the letters that we have collected and translated within the frame of this project, you can see her and her brother's impressions and what they thought about Georgian culture, and including like on very everyday, basically ordinary things in countries such as Supra, for example, what they thought of Georgian Supra. But later, by the early 20th century, Georgia's political future was increasingly uncertain. The collapse of the Russian Empire following the 1970 Bolshevik Revolution created a window of opportunity for Georgia to ascertain its sovereignty. In 1918, on 26th of May, Georgia declared independence. And although Germany was the first country which recognized Georgia's independence, shortly after that, Germany suffered defeat in the World War First, and Georgia was left vulnerable on the international stage. In December 1918, British occupation forces arrived in Georgia, and relations between the Georgian government and the British administration were rather complex. Some Georgians viewed the British as protectors, while others saw them as a new imperial power. At the same time, the Menshevik government was hoping that Britain would provide security against Soviet Russia, which was expanding at the time. However, Britain had different strategic priorities at the time and was primarily interested in supporting the White Army against the Red Army of Russia. So documents from this period suggest that Britain was reluctant to fully endorse Georgia's independence. And exactly a year after Georgia's declaration of independence, Varlam Cherkezishvili, whom I have already mentioned, he was a good friend of Wardrop family who helped them learn Georgian language, wrote to Oliver Wardrop asking him to help Georgia. Although at the time Wardrop had already decided to leave his diplomatic career, Barlam Cherkesishvili convinced him that Oliver was the only British official who truly understood Georgia and whom all Georgians trusted. And in 1919, Oliver Wardrop was appointed as the senior British political commissioner for the South Caucasus, which demonstrated Britain's growing recognition of Georgia's diplomatic importance. And he arrived in Tbilisi, where he was welcomed warmly, he engaged in diplomatic efforts to bring international recognition for Georgia. As a result of his efforts, in 1919, Lord Curzon issued a memorandum on the official recognition of Georgia's independence, along with that of other South Caucasian states. But unfortunately, later in 1921, Red Army invaded Georgia, and a British Army and Britain in general, having different priorities at the international stage, decided not to fight against Red Army in the South Caucasus. So Georgians were left alone, and in 1921 February, the Red Army invaded Georgia, and the 70 years of Soviet occupation started. But even after the Soviet occupation, Oliver Wardrop remained deeply committed to supporting occupied Georgia. And from 1921 to 1927, he worked in Strasbourg at the British General Consulate, and he maintained close ties with Georgian emigres there and the members of the Georgian government in exile. When he went back to England, Oliver actively engaged with Georgian intellectuals, and he facilitated lectures on Georgia at Oxford University, introducing British scholars and general public to Georgia's history, culture, political situation under the Soviet rule. And one of his most fascinating contributions was the foundation of the British Georgian Society in London. Thereafter, in 1930, Wardrop helped establish Georgian Historical Society. And after passing Marjory Wardrop, he also helped create the collection of her writings about Georgia, and those writings are currently preserved at the Bodleian Library. So this Wardrop collection at Bodleian Library legacies featuring Oliver Wardrop, and it is currently located in Western Library, which you can see on the photo. And those of you who are currently in Oxford or have ever been in Oxford, I'm sure that you know where this building is located. So this collection is one of the most significant archives of Georgian literary, historical, and diplomatic materials outside of Georgia. It contains lots of materials, including the correspondence of Marjory and Oliver Wardrop, their manuscripts, their translations, their writings by Georgian figures such as Ilya Chavchavadze, Akaki Tsereteli, Vazhep Shavela, and then their correspondence with people like Ilya Chavchavadze. There are also diplomatic and political documents, British Foreign Office records related to Georgia, maps and travel accounts. It's also important that under the Soviet rule, when Georgian archival materials were very vulnerable to Soviet rule, and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when lots of archival documents were damaged, this wardrobe collection was preserved here in Oxford, and it's been quite a few years, during the last few years, maybe 10 or more, when Ato, Nikoloz, Aleksidze, and the other people started to uncover those collections, and we've learned quite a lot from there. So the story of Marjory and Oliver Wardrop is not just a historical episode. It is a testament that to the enduring power of cultural diplomacy at a time when the Russian Empire sought to suppress Georgia's language, literature, and political aspirations. The Wardrops worked tirelessly to preserve Georgia's cultural identity. And through their translations, diplomatic efforts, and scholarly work, they ensured that Georgia's rich literary heritage and political struggle became known to the wider world. Their legacy also underscores the historical friendship between Georgia and Britain, which was always built on mutual respect, intellectual engagement, and shared values. So I think this this kind of relationship and what we are discussing today is especially relevant today because later in 2014, the government formalized a dialogue between the two countries named after wardrobes, which is currently known as Wardrop Dialogue. However, last year in 2024, the United Kingdom suspended the Wardrop Dialogue and dispensed talks with Georgia because they cited concerns over Georgia's democratic backsliding, suppression of civil liberties, and rising anti-Western rhetoric from the Georgian government. So the UK's decision was part of a broader international response to Georgia's proposed foreign agent law and also rigged elections. In light of this diplomatic tension, the legacy of the Wardropes is more relevant than ever, I believe. Their unwavering belief in Georgia's independence, democratic potential, and cultural richness should be a reminder that true alliances are based on shared values, not just strategic interest. And now I'll give the floor to Nikoloz Aleksidze, who will be speaking about the specific documents from the collection that we have looked at during as part of our research. Thank you.
Thank you, Megi. Let me just quickly share the screen and I'll start speaking. Right, I hope you can see it. And I hope you can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, we can see.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss our project that we've been working on for the last 2 years, but actually something that myself included have been interested in for more than a few years. It's been almost a decade now. So my purpose today is to share with you the progress. It's a sort of progress report, really. And also, first of all, I'd like to thank Shota Rustaveli National Foundation, who sponsored the research, generously sponsored the research. Let me start with the background story, how it all started, and how we came up with the idea to research the so-called new collection of the new collection within the Wardrop collection. It all started back in 2017, actually, when Gillian Evison, who's the keeper of the Oriental and Middle Eastern manuscripts at the Bodleian Libraries, she offered me to somehow celebrate the upcoming 100 years anniversary of the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, which happened in 1918. So Gillian's idea was to come up with a series of events and to eventually publish a book dedicated to the Wardrop collection. So this all materialized eventually from sometime early spring 2017 until mid 2018. We've held several important, I'd say interesting seminars, public lectures, even conferences, and joint events with Georgia, with the Georgian embassy, but also other people interested in the field. And eventually, this whole thing. Well, first of all, we also had a few small exhibitions. This is in the hall of the Western Library. We've exhibited the two important manuscripts, 17th century manuscripts of the Man in the Panther Skin, but also others. The other important as well, result of this project was that eventually now we have a fully digitized, online catalogue of the Wardrop collection, but also about 9 items from the collection are fully digitized and are accessible for the wider public. And this includes both of these manuscripts, 17th century manuscripts, but also an important 11th century manuscript from the Holy Cross Monastery of Jerusalem, a few other medieval manuscripts, but also late 19th century, early 20th century documents pertaining and related to social and political movements in Georgia. So this can be consulted by everyone. The other other result of the project was the book that appeared in 2018, called The Cultural Journey Through the Wardrop Collection. And the purpose of the book was to sort of introduce Georgian culture, history, exclusively through the Wardrop collection. And some of the earliest manuscripts that we have there from the 6th century, so probably from the 5th century, those are just a leaf, palimpsest leaf, up until the early 20th century. So what we wanted to show is how these individual items illustrate various chapters and pages from Georgia's history from late antiquity up until the early 20th century. So it's sort of a popular book, a history book of Georgia's history. But I'd say the highlight of these events was happened quite unexpectedly and was not really planned. And this happened in spring 2017, when we had one of our events. And here you can see Lynn Coffin, who's a translator of the most recent translator of The Knight and the Panther Skin. I'd say the first properly versified version of the poem. And she was giving us public lectures on this topic when the descendants of Oliver Wardrop arrived. We were expecting them, obviously, but what we were not expecting was that they brought a few huge suitcases full of documents, letters, and all sorts of entirely unknown material. And here you can see joyful Gillian checking out the suitcases, and our initial observation was that most of this material was completely unknown, or obviously they were known to Nina Wardrop, who was the daughter of Oliver, who meticulously recorded and sort of processed and was really invested in maintaining and sort of keeping the Wardrop heritage. The initial observation of these manuscripts and of these documents showed that what we had, there were two important sections, or two important parts of the collection. One was the private correspondence between Oliver Wardrop and Marjory Wardrop, of which we were aware that it existed, but we've never seen it, it's never been published, never been examined. And this is a correspondence from, say, most of late 19th century. Well, actually until the death of Marjory Wardrop in 1909. But even more importantly, what we discovered is that it contains Oliver Wardrop's diaries. Oliver Wardrop's diaries were basically of his entire life. This is something exceptionally rare. And the diaries start sometime in mid 1880s up until his death, really, and they documents almost every single day of his life, apart from exceptions when he thought that the day was rather dull, as he would say, and then that would be the only entry in his diary. So we find this huge material, and it was sitting there for a few years because there was no opportunity to sort of study it properly, and eventually, after several attempts, actually, because we got rejected twice. No, it was not rejected. It was actually my fault. I didn't apply properly. We finally got this grant from National Foundation to study, publish, and produce an annotated commentary on these letters and diaries of the Wardrops. Now, and these are as you can see, these are the diaries. Now, for anyone who studies either British diplomatic service of late 19th century, early 20th century, always interested in Georgia, or not just in Georgia, but in general in diplomacy, because to be honest, the Georgian section is really just a fraction of what Oliver has written throughout his life and the places he had traveled to, and various things he's been involved in, because he worked in many places outside of Georgia, whether in Crimea or in Northern Europe or in Central Europe, and many other places. So eventually, what we decided to do, so is instead of studying the entire new corpus of this wardrobe heritage, we decided to focus on one single year of their life. That is from summer to 1894 to February 1895. And now I would like to discuss why this particular year and what happened during this year. Now, this what the wardrobe letters and the wardrobe documents in the first place, what they show us, what we didn't know before, what we didn't have before, that is the perspective that we didn't have before, is a very private perspective on things Georgian and on the developments in Georgia, because we knew how the Georgians reacted to Wardrops. We have a lot of their letters. The old collection of the Georgian Wardrop Collection is full of letters from Georgians, so we basically know what the perception of these people was in Georgia, and we also know a lot about the official involvement of Wardrops in the processes in Georgia, such as the late 19th century national movement, or the emergence of socialist movements, or most importantly, autocephalist. That was a movement in the early 20th century that fought for the independence of the Georgian Church, or for the independence movement, or for anything else. But they were really, really involved in all of these, and they participated in these events. But what we didn't have until now is what was their private as well perception of all of this, right? How they reacted to their perception in Georgia, how they perceived Georgia, what Georgia meant for them, both privately as individuals, and as Nutsa will discuss in a few minutes, for Marjory as a woman, and for Oliver as an aspiring diplomat, as a very ambitious person, both extremely anxious about their careers, about their identities. Marjory is very vocal in her letters about her female identity, about her womanhood, and her not being able to fully participate in things Georgian because of her unfortunate gender, as she would put it. Or Oliver Wardrop, who was constantly anxious about his professional future, and saw. Oh, sorry, something happened, right? I lost the, or Oliver Wardrop, who was constantly anxious about his role, about his career, and he saw Georgia as an opportunity to sort of further his career. Now, what happened in this period? Now, in this period, something radical transformations occurred in Georgia. Now, first of all, it was Marjory's letter to Ilya Georgievadze. It was a scandalous letter in a sense, because Marjory sent a letter to Ilya in Georgian, in nearly perfect Georgian, asking him to allow her to translate his poem, one of his poems, into English. Now, Ilya Georgievadze's reaction was also quite dramatic, because he was extremely happy, and he perceived this as a first opportunity to sort of introduce Georgian culture to Europe. Now, late 19th century Georgia and the press, social press, was an extremely dramatic place in Georgia. And this letter by Marjory, it caused an outburst of polemical exchange of letters. Basically, Georgian men criticizing Georgian women for not being able to speak proper Georgian, unlike this unknown British woman whose Georgian was so perfect. And this caused quite an upheaval in Georgia. So you might think that this is a minor event. However, it did have repercussions in discussions of identity, the knowledge of the language, gender issues, and many others. The other important thing that happened in terms of this grand picture that Megi just discussed is that Marjory and Oliver met for the first time Varlam Cherkezishvili, who was a famed anarchist. He was a friend, a very close friend of Pyotr Kropotkin, who was the leader of Russian and British anarchists in late 19th century, and he was his closest ally. And Varlam was actually illegally in Britain because he had escaped from Siberia, and he ended up there. He needed some money, so he became a tutor of Marjory and Oliver and taught them some Georgian. But his influence was paramount because his perception of what Georgia was supposed to look like, of illegal activities, of sort of setting up illegal press, setting up illegal channels of communication with West Georgia. So both Oliver and Marjory, judging by the diaries, are extremely involved in all this, and they have this adventurous spirit, and they sort of want to contribute to Georgia's emancipation somehow. So eventually Oliver embarks on a journey to Georgia, and again, something that we didn't know before emerges in his correspondence. Now, we knew about his travels, but what we didn't know is that Oliver was really closely connected to the secret Georgian Society, sort of semi-independence movement society that was based in Constantinople. And he helped them. He first met them in Geneva, but he was closely involved in sort of setting up a illegal press for the society. The important thing about Oliver's role in this whole thing is that in the late 19th century is basically known for many illegal clandestine movements in Georgia, but practically all of them are socialist, Marxist, whereas Oliver was anything but Marxist, and he didn't like them at all until the very end. He was not really happy with Marxists, so he found his darlings, as I say, his own understanding of what Georgia as a potential independent country in the future should look like. What happens afterwards is that Oliver is joined by Marjory in Georgia, and this is a fascinating correspondence, and Nutsa will probably say a few words about it, of sort of Marjory's despair and that she will never see Georgia, and that and her letters are full of anxiety and despair, and finally she makes it to Georgia. And the whole journey, the letters that she sends from the boat from Georgia and from the entire journey is like her perception of she becomes part of as if she became part of her classical education. She imagines herself as a kind of an Argonaut who traveled to Colchis and and endured all the perilous journeys throughout the Mediterranean and so on and so forth. And then they travel to Western Georgia because of the epidemic in Tbilisi. They have to stay in Western Georgia, and eventually they leave Georgia in February when Oliver receives vice consulship in Kerch in Crimea. Now, Oliver was really hopeful that he would become a British consul in Batumi, but this never happened. Actually, never happened until 1920 or 1919, obviously, and he's extremely disappointed. But nevertheless, he got his first appointment. Now, what we learned from this correspondence and from the diaries of Oliver Wardrop is that is a certain, until now unknown, as it were, First of all, what we learn is sort of a prosopographical landscape of Georgia. So we learn about the social networks. He really tries to connect with pretty much everyone in the elite. He interacts with everyone. He creates groups. So he's in the center of attention. He meets all these people, and pretty much everyone we know of, we've heard of in Georgia in late 19th century becomes his acquaintance, becomes his point of contact, his entry point into a certain aspect of Georgian culture. So you can tell from his diaries up until the very end that he really wants to become part of the British intelligence service on the one hand, and he really is anxiously wants to meet everyone in the intelligence service and sort of pave his way through the Middle East or Russia or anyone else. And what he does is that he believes that his cultural role, his knowledge of Georgian, his knowledge of Georgian culture, his translation and his translations, his involvement in political and in cultural developments in Georgia will contribute to his future career. So I'd say that Oliver Wardrop is one of the first Westerners in Georgia to sort of use soft power to sort of understand the role of soft power in diplomatic and political negotiations in the future. And finally, what I would like to say is that this particular year is crucial for the proper understanding of what happened in 1920, right? In the official recognition of Georgia by the Allies. So you can see here two entries from his diaries. One is from August 1894, where he first met Vaziani, Varlam Cherkezishvili, the anarchist, and tells the story of how this person set up a fake company in Siberia and how he managed to escape exile from Siberia, first to Petersburg, and then he got a fake passport and ended up in the UK, where he spent most of his life. And finally, January 12, 1920, as you can see, he crossed out 1920 and placed recognition, right? So that is the date when the Allies officially recognized Georgia's independence. And Oliver's role in this whole process was paramount. And to sum up, what I'd like to say is that the events of late 1840, early 1895 were crucial in terms of setting up, creating the social landscape, sort of understanding the social landscape and the political landscape of those actors who would later become crucial in the formation of the political landscape in early 20th century Georgia, and in the process of foundation of Georgia's Democratic Republic in 1918, right? So that's what the book is going to be about. It is going to be heavily annotated, a lot of commentaries. It will have several layers of sort of text, including letters, diaries, commentary, additional material from the old collection from the old Wardrop collection, but also from Wardrop-related material from other repositories in Georgia, such as the National Archives, the library, and so on. Well, that's about it. Thank you very much for your attention. Obviously, if you have any questions, once Nutsa is finished with her presentation, I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you, Nutsa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I set up share my slides. I would like to thank Sophia for organizing this. Of course, Megi for being part of this project. We also have Tsigule who's also part of the project, and Nikoloz, obviously, for getting us all involved. This is an unusual project for me because I'm not a historian. I'll begin with a disclaimer. It's the first time I'm part of an archival project like this, and really my role here is very unimportant. I'm an anthropologist, and I study anxiety as a culturally situated and collective phenomenon. And what this means is that I'm interested in how culturally and historically prevalent notions about personhood, physical body, but also collective identity participate in how we feel, how we construe our moods in relation to broader social relations. And this lens inadvertently perhaps determined what I was attuned to when reading letters and diaries of both Marjory and Oliver. So that's the kind of the title of my presentation. Tells you something about the nature of the commentaries that I'll be making here, and it's very I'm going to be very brief. It's also very based on fraction of this archival material, and it's very fragmented in a way. So I'm kind of working my way through it and trying to find my role in this project this way. But what was striking for me, that there's a story about a struggling woman that transpires through Marjory's letters. And this story, it seems to me, speaks to the broader meanings that are part of the prevailing notions about femininity and female body in Victorian England. First, there's the striking, or even sometimes obsessive, what seemed to me, preoccupation with illness in both diaries and in the letters. Reading these letters and felt like being in one of Jane Austen's novels or behind the scenes of the novels. And one really gets a sense of how the vulnerability to various illnesses and epidemics, just catching a cold, is feared as something that can become the major impediment to one's life's plans, but also it's something that is sometimes a crucial driving force of one's biography. So there's a lot of accent in this letter on who's feeling how, who's ill, even sometimes people are introduced by their physical condition. If one looks into the broader historical context, this frailty and weakness are central to the ideas about womanhood that dominate Victorian England, and maybe probably other places as well. Especially medical establishment and the discourse of the medical establishment of the era. There's this kind of this weakness is what justifies the political system. For instance, women's right not to vote, women's right to vote. So this trope of the perpetually unwell woman, as one of the author cites it, is central to the Victorian medical literature, in which women were understood as unhealthy versions of men, and those were limited in many ways. Indeed, there is this studies, disability studies, even that looks into how the medical discourse of the period really imposes this idea that women's physical weakness, along with their irrationality and excessive emotionality, is central to why female bodies were incapable of exercising the rights and freedoms which men were naturally entitled. This is something actually that a student in Oxford writes, Lucy McCormick, who studies modern British history at the University of Oxford. What we see, I thought I saw in Marjory's letters, is how the social construct then of disability informs Marjory's self-portrayal. Her sense of weakness drives this profound preoccupation with health and illness. Not only her own, but most people she mentions are introduced by saying something about their health condition, rheumatism, or catching a cold, or so forth. But also there's the general themes we see in these letters are kind of colored by weakness, illness, shyness, despair, and sense of entrapment of a woman. Misery and sadness are companion to Marjory's sense that she's leading an aimless life compared to her brothers, and that she's trapped in this domestic life. It's a long quote, but this letter was really really striking in that sense, because the image of Marjory from other side, from Georgia's side, really leaves out this side of her. And she says, I'm only a horrid woman instead of an independent man, that I have to stay home doing nothing, and that everyone's expecting that she's going to be happy with this domestic life. So she really feels this despair that there is no other way, and she feels that she doesn't really feel hopeful that any day she'll really travel to Georgia. Part of this female subjectivity that is construed as impaired, as defective, as incapable, and not just in physical terms, but in terms of features of character, is the reason why we see this so much constant self-deprecation in Marjory's letters, in the image that she construes of herself. So in various instances, she conveys herself as worthless, as an inferior to her brother. And despite her rebellious attitude toward the social structure that tethers her to this domestic life, the image she holds of herself is that of a shy and timid creature. And this, of course, comes in stark contrast with this kind of aggrandizing narrative that Georgians have created of a woman who is so intelligent, bold in her scientific or literary endeavors, and thus emancipated. And this contrast of two images, of course, terrifies her in anticipation of her journey to Georgia. And I felt like there is this very profound anxiety right before embarking on her journey, which encompasses both excitement about this adventure, but also the fear of her being revealed, of the revelation. So she writes and writes to Oliver again and again to somehow subside Georgians' expectations so that she can avoid confronting their disappointment. So there's a lot of discussion in her letters about, I'm sure they're going to be disappointed when they really see me. And then I thought there was some kind of, this narrative really had some curve. There's some sort of affective transformation, if not identity transformation, that takes place in Georgia for Marjory. And her letters written from Georgia are somewhat, if not altogether, different in their sentimental genre and tone. There are, of course, some leftovers of the language of timidness and shyness and frailty, but the overall tone of misery and sadness and the sense of entrapment really disappears from these later letters. Something else also happens, a reversal kind of in another sense. While we see in the earlier letters this constant complaint about ill health, this perpetual sense of unwellness and fear of illness is replaced with this. In almost every letter that Oliver and Marjory write from Georgia, there's only a brief reference to the physical state, and it's always that they're in the best of health. So this was something kind of maybe not transformation, but this shift in tone and the narrative of adventure in many ways that I saw in these letters. This is the end of my slideshow. I lost the Teams window. Okay. I think we are now open for Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Thank you so much. That was fantastic from everyone. Super interesting. Maybe I can start with the first question, but if you want to ask a question, you can either press the Q&A button that is right next to the chat, and our speakers can read it, or you can raise your hand and speak if you would like to. But I have a question, I guess, for both Nikoloz and Nutsa about Marjory. I mean, I've read a few of Oliver Wardrop's letters, but not that many, and my time period that I research is a little bit later than this. So I'm kind of curious, you're talking then about Marjory Wardrop and how she views femininity and all of these things, and she doesn't seem to have these very feminist ideals. This is she's obviously frustrated with her position, but she's not saying, women should be who cares, whatever, women should be able to go to Georgia, do all these things. do we have any information on her interactions like with other important women in Georgia, like any interaction with feminism either in Georgia or at home in the UK? I'd be really curious about that. It's not anything to do with my research, just something that I found interesting from the talk.
Do you mind if I take that one? Because yeah, the short answer is yes, definitely. I mean, she was in touch with practically every influential Georgian woman in Georgia, and we have lots of correspondences, lots of letters from them. And then she even identifies a certain feminist movement in Georgia, you know, spearheaded by people like Marjory Wardrop, Cherkezishvili, and others. And in her letters, in her travelogue, in her diaries on the journey to Georgia, one of the central aspects that she highlights in her journey is that she seems extremely surprised that there's so many, the way she puts it, so many female journalists who are extremely active, who run their own printing presses and the publishing houses. And because one of their closest friends was the wife of Georgi Tsereteli, and she was the publisher of a journal Kovali, which became soon afterwards became the main social democratic publication. So she's extremely surprised and extremely impressed by the activity of Georgian women, political activity, social activity, and activity as journalists. And when she went back to Chislehurst, went back to the UK, she gave lectures to kids and to children. Actually, we have recordings of those. We actually have transcripts of those lectures in the collection, specifically devoted to this topic of Georgian women as politically active, and the way she puts it is basically unlike us. That's what she said. It says in those letters. But there is also, you're also right that she does not perceive herself as an activist. She's not a radical in late 19th century sense, and this is quite obvious when they may meet. A person, maybe you've heard of her, Nanny Dryhurst. Now, Nanny Dryhurst was an anarchist, an Irish anarchist, and she was extremely active in all sorts of anarchist movements, in women's rights movements, and so on and so forth. And she traveled to Georgia because in 1905, 1906, because Georgia was by then sort of a center of anarchist processes, and they knew each other. They introduced the Wardrops introduced them to Ilya Javjawadze, but you can see in their communication a certain coldness, as it were. They're not in the same ideological league. You can tell, and the Wardrops are very conservative, whereas the others are not. So there is that. But she does perceive Georgia as a space of her own self-realization, and as a place where women can do what she couldn't do back in England.
Hey, wow, that's really interesting. Thank you. So again, if anyone else has any questions, I'm just trying to load the Q&A, but just feel free to just raise your hand and speak, or just write in the Q&A. So please do. Don't be shy. If not, I can ask another question because I have loads, but I don't want to monopolize the questions.
I thought Megi raised her hand. No?
I accidentally pressed the button. Yeah, I was checking the Q&A section and accidentally pressed it.
Well, actually, I'll go ahead and ask another question then. I also want to know about like the types of people that the Wardrops were associating with the whole time. I know they were kind of meeting everyone and all sort of political figures who became very important in like the First Republic, but was there a shift in how they viewed Georgian politics from the beginning, from like the sort of late 19th century to the early 20th? Is there any sort of like political evolution that specifically Oliver goes through? Because if Marjory is feeling like self-realization in Georgia, does Oliver's political views soften or not so much? I'm curious to know about that.
Sorry for monopolizing. I mean, I'll answer that. Oliver is an extremely conservative person. He identifies as conservative. He's Christian. When he comes to Georgia, he mingles with like-minded people. So you will not see him meet any social democrats in late 19th. I mean, social democrats by late 19th are quite young, but so is Oliver. Actually, he's the same age as the future heads of Georgia Democratic Republic, but he meets rather sort of more centrist and right-wing and less populist the people, and he knows them all. He knows, and he's also involved in all sorts of secret society. Well, they were not particularly secret, but all sorts of nationalistic societies that met once in a while in Georgia. And when he came back to Georgia in 1911, actually for the third time, that was his third visit. Actually, he was there in 1880, 88, 1890. 1911. He basically, what he does is basically he revisits his acquaintances. He revisits the same people, and he likes to keep his circle of acquaintances. And obviously in 1919 and 1920 he has to meet everyone because he's an official representative. He cannot be that picky. If you remember, he does say at some point in his letters to his wife later on that he really likes the Georgian government, but then he says that they happen to be socialists, which makes them less gentlemanly. That was his understanding of socialists by then. So what you can trace in those diaries is that he's very meticulous at sort of creating acquaintances and circles, and he knows where he goes and who's he's going to meet, and he writes down all the names, and then you can identify those social circles who will never meet together because they were at odds for some reason or another. And for example, in one of the biggest scandals that broke out in the late 19th century was a fight between Ilya Georgiadze and Vano Machabeli over some policies in the bank. And Marjory is sending a letter to Oliver from Chislehurst asking him if he could sort of bring them together, because this is a major tragedy for Georgia, whereas he doesn't really succeed at that, and he sort of creates independent social networks. But again, his social circle in late 19th century turned out to be crucial in 1919, sort of in his later appointment.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions actually. Oh, three, but why don't we go like Taya first, if you put your hand up, because you're brave enough to show your face, and then we'll read the ones from the chat. So thank you guys. We will answer your questions on the chat as well. Taya, why don't you go ahead and ask yours?
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating presentations. And I have to be honest, and I don't know much about wardrobes, and I started to interested in their lives when I came here. We have, as I noticed, the very iconic images of brothers and sisters, and they are very cultivated in Georgian society, and they became kind of symbols of these relationships between Georgia and Europe and so on. And so it's really amazing and fascinating. But I'm wondering if we could find something colonial approaches from their side, and as the Georgia is still not developed or semi-developed, and this evolutionism still exists in this academia, I mean British and Oxford. So if we could catch something on this, if feels so in this, if there is reflections on it, I'm just wondering in this point. Thank you so much. It was really great and very useful for me. Thank you.
I'm very sorry that I'm taking a question. I've just been because I had to.
Because you are an expert on the.
Yes, the answer is yes. There is a lot to learn about British colonial perceptions, not so colonial, but sort of Orientalist perceptions in late 19th century, especially in the dealings with the Georgians. And for example, Oliver Wardrop is always struck by the sort of a double identity of Georgia. It's European and it's Oriental, whatever that meant by then, identities. And he would always point this out. You would go, for example, you'll go to a market, and he'd say that the grim Persian sit there, and behind the Persian, a little girl who's dressed in a European schoolgirl's uniform would run about. And this is something they always notice. Where, for example, they like pointing out how the public gardens worked in Tbilisi. There was a public garden called Mushtaidi, which was a place where all the traditional, as well orientally disposed elites would gather. Whereas in the other way around, in Ortajala, those would gather, and Mushtaidi was the most European place. So there is this sense of this sense of the transitional sense, the sense of transition going on, and they do feel this. But also in every little detail, like perceiving Georgians as hyper-emotional, and this coming from Oliver and Wardrop. If you read their letters, I mean, if someone's emotional and sentimental, it's basically them. But then they always just stress that Georgians are so emotional, over the top in pretty much everything. You know, their understanding of food, and they sort of like it, but they can't take it. And it's too much for them, and they always complain about the amount of food and the way food is presented in Georgia, and so on and so forth. But yes, if you read this thoroughly, you will notice those hints that they sometimes try to suppress, but it doesn't really work all the time, as it happens. Brian has a question, as I can see. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to?
No, they're not extensive. So, as I said, the question is, are Wardrop diaries good diaries, as well as being unquestionably extensive? They're not good in a sense that because Oliver is obviously aware that these diaries will one day or another go public, and he works for the British intelligence and the Foreign Service, and he's really careful what he writes there. And some of the entries are really redacted because he sort of regretted writing something down. And but in this sense, sometimes they're very, very short. Sometimes it's just a list of events of people that he met. But in some cases, he becomes surprisingly candid. For example, in his dealings with those proto-revolutionaries that are based in Constantinople and who sort of want to liberate Georgia, he's almost very closely involved. And he becomes his diaries become more and more extensive when he writes down when he starts writing as an official, as a High Commissioner of the British Empire in Caucasia. So it's both. Sometimes they're very short. Sometimes he would complain that the day is dull, and that was pretty much it. Otherwise, in other cases, it's very eloquent.
And then the next question is, we have to read them out, just so everyone can understand what they are. From Beatrice saying, will you be publishing more on Wardrop and the wider Caucasus?
Nutsa can answer that question as well, but I've published on Wardrops. The previous book is on Wardrops. This one will be about them, but Nutsa and myself and Megi, we recently publish on Caucasia, on various aspects of Caucasian history, and so yeah, and Nutsa's work. I think you can comment on this as well.
Well, no, we were thinking of besides the books that Nikoloz described, we were thinking of publishing a paper, which could be was kind of finding our anthropological entryway into these texts, and maybe something along the lines of the commentary that I was making. But it would be interesting to see kind of this contrast between the existing discourse about womanhood and health, maybe physical body in Georgia and in Victorian England, and kind of and maybe touch on some of the questions that Thea just asked, because that was the theme that kind of references that you have in mind when reading these texts. Really, Edward Said's understanding of thinking about Orientalism really comes to mind, but it also shows you how this worked in a very nuanced way, which did not always necessarily mean some kind of condescending. Because when we explain Orientalism, for instance, to our students, we usually talk about this confrontation of two worlds in terms of one being emancipated and progressive and another being wild and something that needs to be tamed and civilized. And it's not quite like that. It's not that narrative entirely that transpires from these texts. It's more interesting and more nuanced, and in some ways, especially in Marjory's letters, I think it was interesting that you don't sense that condescending attitude toward this. The other way, there's a lot of fascination and maybe exoticism related to Georgia for Marjory, but there's something else too, and it's interesting to think through that as well. So maybe one of the publications will be more attuned to these topics and focused on femininity in that terms, the role of femininity in this kind of confrontation of different worlds, or moving between different worlds.
And we have a question now from Marcus, so just go ahead and ask. And also thank you, Brian, also for asking your question, and don't worry about being too shy to appear on camera. Go ahead, Marcus.
I thank you. I had a question for Oliver, and do we know much about what his activities kind of post-Bolshevik takeover? Like, did he continue to lobby for Georgia? Did he oppose the Bolsheviks in any way? I know he set up some historical societies in London, but do we know more concretely what his activities were post Bolshevik takeover?
Yeah, I think I couldn't hear really well, but I think I understood the question. So yes, I think if the question was about Oliver's involvement in with Georgia after Georgia's Sovietization, then yes, it was crucial, because as you know, he set up this the Georgian Society, but also the Journal for the Study of Georgia, Kartvelian Studies, and many other things, and he would bring scholars of Georgia to the Western universities, also Oxford, to give various lectures. But also, one of my favorite correspondences that I intended to publish with my students, but we didn't finish this project, was Oliver's correspondence with the wife of Varlam Cherkezishvili, Frida, who was a Dutch woman, an extremely interesting correspondence. And you can see the cadence of this tone in their correspondence when they're extremely close friends, the family friends, and then they sort of discuss the process that led towards Georgia's independence, but also after. And it continues after, and then you can notice this general feeling that was prevalent in Georgia, in sort of Georgia-related circles, that this is very temporary, that the Bolsheviks will soon leave, and that the nightmare is going to end soon. And then you could trace in this correspondence of a disappointment when they sort of slowly get to realize that the Soviets are here to stay, and how they adjust their expectations and their expectations of what future Georgia, how it becomes more realistic of what future Georgia is going to look like. So yeah, a huge chunk of a Wardrop collection is actually post 1921 as well. So there's a lot to. I'm not entirely sure that I answered the question, but I think I more or less did.
I have another question actually now, and Marcus says yes, so the question was definitely answered. I'm kind of curious as well to go on to what Taya said, about how Oliver Wardrop in his letters, because I haven't seen that many, in his letters like corresponds or like introduces other British diplomats or British politicians to the idea of Georgia. Because what I have read for my undergrad thesis is the documents at Kew in the War Office, where the like British Foreign Ministry is basically getting these like missives from Wardrop, you know, describing what the situation is in Georgia. And my understanding was that he was much like less imperialist or colonialist or orientalist than these guys. I mean, they have a Russian expert in the British Foreign Ministry who's working on Georgia, and he has a meeting with the unofficial Georgian ambassador to London, where he says, you know, for basically a savage, this guy is pretty well spoken. So I'm kind of interested in, obviously there's like this huge gap between how maybe the British Foreign Ministry view Georgia and how even Oliver Wardrop, as someone who's more of like a fan of Georgia, views Georgia and British foreign policy towards Georgia. Do we see that at all in his letters with like maybe bringing people to Georgia? I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I'm kind of curious, how does he introduce it to other English men or women?
He does, but this is not. This doesn't transpire in the new collection because we're interested in his diaries and his private correspondence with Marjory. However, in the rest of the Wardrop collection, it's all about it. It's all about Oliver trying to get people interested in Georgia. Actually, we do have some bits and pieces of that from some later period also in the new collection, and he acts as a sort of introducer of Georgia, popularizer of Georgia among pretty much. I wanted to come actually to follow up. I wanted to comment on his perception of other people involved with Georgia, for example. Now, you're absolutely right. He's much less colonialist or imperialist than others are. For example, whereas you can see that he's very interested, very keen on meeting other Georgian scholars or travelers to Georgia in late 19th century, there are some that he doesn't like at all and he doesn't want to have anything in common with. For example, one of them is, if you've heard of Clive Phillips Wally. So Clive Phillips Wally, he was a nasty character. He was a Canadian British person. He was a hunter and a traveler. He wrote this book called Savage Svanetia, and he travels to Svanetia on a major game hunt. And his perceptions are extremely Orientalist, and they know each other, but he doesn't want to have anything in common. This guy was famous for his anti-Semitic sentiments, for his justification of Russian pogroms, and many other things. So they do have, I think, Oliver and Marjory are very selective in who they interact with in terms from moral perspective, and they have this self-critical approach.
Sorry, I'm struggling to unmute myself a bit. We have another question in the Q&A from Mia Wilkinson.
Sorry, I think you...
Yeah, sorry. If someone else could read it, that would be great.
Yes, I will read it. So Mia is asking, I would like to know if there is a mentioning of Father Petre Onjashvili in Oliver Wardrop's diaries. They met on the boat in traveling from Kerch, and Oliver promised to help Father Petre with getting a copy of Georgian Bible from Athos Monastery. I
believe there is, but we have not really. I mean, I've seen it. I'm fairly confident I've seen it. I think they met in Kerch, if I remember correctly. The trouble is that we are not going that far. we probably should, well, I haven't gone that far in terms of sort of analyzing the diaries, because sort of the terminus ante quem in our case is them leaving Georgia, which is not entirely justified. I agree, because when they go to Crimea, they actually continue interacting, and sort of they mingle with Georgians in Crimea. That's the primary point of the contacts are Georgian. So I think yes, and if you would like proper references, I'm more than happy to look them up for you and send you the images.
Okay, if anyone else has any questions, please go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, I guess we can wrap up if there's no more questions. I'm going to give it a minute. In the meantime, I would just like to say, started by the Wardrops, the Oxford University still has a lot of like very active stuff going on Georgian culture, politics, everything. And we have a great Georgian program, and there's going to be an event in a couple months organized by Megi, the Georgian Forum, and also the Oxford Georgian Society, which I don't think I even introduced, which I'm president of. We're very active. We have political events, cultural, literary, everything. So if you would like to see more stuff based in Oxford, we do a lot on Georgia. So, you can follow us if you're interested, or email me or anything for more events like this. So just so everyone knows, I don't think I properly introduced that before. If we don't have any more questions.
So I think Ian Colvin has a question.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that. Oh, okay.
He just posted it.
I see. So I'll read that out so we get it recorded. He says, is Oliver as well plugged into Russian circles? I assume he would be, but I've mostly come in contact with him in terms of Georgia. Are there any hints, in addition to his love for Georgia, that he sees himself as a participant in the great game that was going on with Russia for this period? And I presume he spoke Russia, did he?
Yes. Yes, yeah, definitely. First of all, in this correspondence, we in his diaries, he extensively chronicles his meetings with Russians in Petersburg, in Moscow, and all sorts of places in Russia, because he traveled to Russia extensively, but not just in Russia. But Ian is absolutely right to say that, to point out that he has that Oliver really wants to be part of this great game, diplomatic game, and he meets people, Russian spies, as he puts it, and knows all sorts of people involved in this big processes. And yeah, he wants to be part of this. And whereas for love, I think it's just Georgia where he speaks about love for sort of devotion and emotions, whereas the rest is sort of business for him. But yeah, definitely, and he does really want to be part of this whole big process. He even says things like, if not Batumi, then anywhere in southern Russia, really, where he wants to be based as a consul, he would be extremely happy to do that. Sophia, can I say one more thank you, actually, to one more?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I've mentioned Gillian, but I really want to stress that without Gillian Everson and her contribution, nothing would have happened, because she was the master. She came up with the idea to sort of revitalize the Wardrop collection, to sort of launch all the events in 2017, 2018, and she sort of. Well, Gillian became a kind of a patron saint of all things Georgian in Oxford when I was there for my 10 years in Oxford, and she still is. So we really owe her deep gratitude for everything that she's done, not just the Wardrop collection, but pretty much for everything Georgian.
Also, I wanted to extend those gratitudes to Nikoloz Kontovas, because he is now the curator of the Wardrop Collection, and this project was basically the first time for me to deal with those collections. Although I have worked in the Soviet archives, the Wardrop collection is something very different from the Georgian Soviet archives. So, and he helped me a lot. He gave me access to all of the documents and helped me to find the ones that Nikoloz and Nutsa would find useful to work on. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks to Nikoloz as well. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us today, but yeah.
And if there's any like final ones that you guys want to say, feel free. Don't let me boss you around too much.
I just want to thank you once again, and Megi, and everyone for organizing, and everyone else for attending and asking great questions. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
And thank you so much for just, everyone who attended. Thank you so much, Nikoloz and Nutsa. What a fantastic presentation. Also great like historical context from Megi. And also for me, just to hear like not only a historical sort of interpretation, but also more of an anthropological, really, really fascinating. And thank you so much for all our attendees. And yeah, fantastic. What a great event.